On January 20, 2026, Captain Ibrahim Traoré ordered the arrest of Lieutenant Colonel Paul-Henry Damiba, the man who had ruled Burkina Faso before him, and charged him with treason, espionage, and terrorism. Within hours, military intelligence units began rounding up senior generals across Ouagadougou. By nightfall, the entire command structure that had dominated Burkina Faso's armed forces for decades had been dismantled. This was not a routine shakeup. This was a purge that severed Burkina Faso's last remaining ties to French influence in the Sahel, and Paris knew it. The shock wasn't just that Damiba had been detained. It was that Traoré had moved so quickly, so thoroughly, and with such precision that foreign intelligence agencies watching from Paris, Washington, and Brussels were caught completely off guard. For years, France had maintained indirect control over military appointments in Francophone Africa through a web of training programs, intelligence sharing, and personal relationships with senior officers. In Burkina Faso, those relationships ran deep. Generals who had trained at French military academies, who communicated regularly with French defense attaches, who coordinated counter-terrorism operations under French oversight, suddenly found themselves stripped of rank, placed under investigation, or forced into early retirement. The network that France had spent half a century building was being torn apart in a matter of days. The Traoré's justification was clear and damning. Intelligence investigations had uncovered systematic sabotage within the military high command. Senior officers loyal to Damiba had deliberately undermined anti-terror operations in the northern and eastern regions, areas where jihadist groups affiliated with Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State had been gaining ground for years. Leaked communications revealed that these commanders had withheld critical intelligence from frontline units, delayed the deployment of reinforcements during active combat, and redirected military supplies away from areas under attack. In some cases, convoys carrying ammunition and food to besieged outposts were mysteriously rerouted, leaving soldiers without resources in the middle of firefights. The pattern was unmistakable. This wasn't incompetence. This was coordinated sabotage designed to create chaos, weaken the government, and justify a return to power for Damiba and his faction. The purge didn't just remove these officers. It replaced them with something France had never anticipated: battlefield commanders who had no ties to the old guard, no history of foreign training, and no loyalty to Western military doctrine. Traoré promoted young officers who had spent the last 3 years fighting jihadists in the Sahel's most dangerous front lines, men in their 30s who had earned their ranks through combat rather than connections. These were not the polished, French-educated generals who attended international conferences and coordinated with NATO-aligned forces. These were soldiers who had watched their units get ambushed while waiting for air support that never came, who had seen villages burned because intelligence wasn't shared in time, who had grown deeply suspicious of the foreign advisors embedded within their ranks. Their loyalty was not to France. It was to Traoré, to the survival of Burkina Faso, and to a vision of sovereignty that did not include Western oversight. That France's response was swift and predictable. Diplomatic statements condemned the arrests as authoritarian overreach. European Union officials expressed concern over the rule of law. Human rights organizations, many funded by Western governments, issued reports questioning the fairness of the military tribunals. Behind closed doors, French diplomats began floating the possibility of sanctions, targeting individuals within Traoré's government and threatening to freeze financial assistance. The language was familiar, the playbook unchanged. But this time, it didn't land the way it used to. Burkina Faso wasn't isolated. It wasn't alone. And that changed everything. Mali and Niger, both members of the Alliance of Sahel States alongside Burkina Faso, immediately signaled their support. In Bamako, Colonel Assimi Goïta's government released a statement backing Traoré's actions and calling the purge a necessary step to eliminate foreign interference. In Niamey, General Abdourahmane Tiani echoed the sentiment, framing the arrests as part of a broader struggle to reclaim African military institutions from neo-colonial control. The coordinated messaging was deliberate. The three countries had already expelled French troops, closed French military bases, and terminated long-standing defense agreements. Now they were aligning their internal security structures, sharing intelligence, and coordinating military operations without Western involvement. The purge in Burkina Faso wasn't just a domestic power play. It was a signal to the entire region that the old system was finished. What made this moment so consequential was the timing. For years, France had argued that its military presence in the Sahel was essential to prevent jihadist groups from overrunning fragile governments. French officials pointed to the chaos in Mali after the 2012 coup, the rise of Islamic State affiliates in the Lip-Toko-Gourma region, and the steady expansion of extremist networks as evidence that African armies couldn't handle the threat alone. But the narrative was starting to crack. Despite France's Operation Barkhane deploying thousands of troops across the region, jihadist attacks had not decreased. In fact, they had intensified. Civilian casualties had risen. Entire districts in northern Burkina Faso had fallen under insurgent control. And while French forces conducted high-profile airstrikes and claimed tactical victories, the violence on the ground continued to spread. That Traoré's government had grown convinced that France's strategy was not designed to win. It was designed to manage the conflict, to maintain a permanent state of instability that justified continued French military presence and access to the region's uranium, gold, and strategic corridors. The leaked intelligence suggesting senior Burkinabe officers had sabotaged operations fit perfectly into this suspicion. If French-aligned generals were deliberately weakening the military's effectiveness, it meant the entire counterterrorism framework had been compromised from within. Traoré's purge was not just about loyalty. It was about operational survival. The immediate impact was measurable. Within weeks of the restructuring, Burkina Faso's military began reporting more effective operations in previously contested areas. Frontline commanders, no longer constrained by orders from Ouagadougou that seemed designed to limit their success, started coordinating directly with Malian and Nigerian forces across borders. Joint patrols increased. Intelligence sharing improved. Ambushes that used to devastate isolated units were now being anticipated and countered. The new command structure wasn't perfect, and the insurgency was far from defeated, but the shift in momentum was real. Soldiers on the ground noticed. Civilians in affected regions noticed. And foreign observers, particularly in Paris, noticed too that France's alarm wasn't just about losing influence in Burkina Faso. It was about what this represented for the entire Francophone sphere in Africa. For decades, Paris had maintained a carefully managed system of political, economic, and military dependencies across West and Central Africa. Military coups were tolerated or even supported if they preserved French interests. Leaders who challenged the system faced diplomatic isolation, economic pressure, or, in extreme cases, covert destabilization. But the Alliance of Sahel States had broken that script. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger had not only rejected French military presence, they had done so without collapsing into chaos, as Paris had predicted. They had turned to Russia for security partnerships, opened discussions with China for infrastructure investment, and begun coordinating regional defense without seeking Western approval. The purge in Burkina Faso was the latest and most aggressive step in this realignment. What made Traoré's move particularly dangerous from a French perspective was that it worked. Damiba, who had positioned himself as a potential counterweight to Traoré and maintained quiet channels with foreign actors, was now facing life imprisonment. The generals who might have facilitated a counter-coup were either detained, retired, or sidelined. The military officers rising through the ranks owed nothing to France and everything to the government that promoted them from the trenches. There was no longer a faction within Burkina Faso's armed forces that Paris could activate if political conditions shifted. The leverage was gone. This is where the stakes become clear. France's entire post-colonial strategy in Africa has relied on its ability to influence military leadership. When civilian governments became uncooperative, Paris could quietly support or tolerate military interventions that restored favorable conditions. When military governments became too independent, diplomatic and economic pressure could force compliance or create openings for new leadership. But that cycle required access, relationships, and dependencies that no longer existed in Burkina Faso. Traore had severed those connections, and he had done it in a way that strengthened rather than weakened his position. The diplomatic pressure from France and its allies intensified, but it lacked the force it once carried. Threats of sanctions meant little to a government that had already reoriented its foreign relations. Burkina Faso had shifted its gold exports away from European markets and toward buyers in the Middle East and Asia. It had begun accepting Russian military instructors to train the newly promoted officer corps. It had deepened cooperation with Turkey, which had provided drones that proved effective in tracking insurgent movements across the Sahel's vast ungoverned spaces. The economic tools that might have destabilized previous governments were no longer sufficient. Condemnations from human rights organizations also fell flat. Traore's government pointed to the intelligence reports showing deliberate sabotage, the leaked communications, the diverted supplies, and asked a simple question: what should a government do when its own military leadership is actively working to ensure its failure? The framing resonated not just in Burkina Faso, but across the region. Accusations of authoritarianism were met with counter-accusations of neo-colonial interference. Calls for democratic process were dismissed as thinly veiled attempts to reinstall compliant regimes. The moral high ground that Western governments once claimed in African affairs had eroded, and the purge became another flashpoint in that larger struggle. Inside Burkina Faso, public reaction was mixed but largely supportive. Many Burkinabe, exhausted by years of escalating violence and frustrated by the failure of previous governments to stem the bloodshed, saw the purge as a necessary corrective. Soldiers returning from the front lines spoke openly about the incompetence and corruption of the old command structure. Families who had lost loved ones in poorly planned operations welcomed the accountability, even if it came through military tribunals rather than civilian courts. There was also a nationalist current running through the response, a sense that Burkina Faso was finally asserting itself against foreign powers that had dictated its security policies for too long. Traore understood this sentiment and amplified it, framing the purge not as a crackdown, but as a liberation. But the long-term implications are still unfolding. The Alliance of Sahel States, strengthened by this episode, is now operating as a functional political and military bloc. The three governments are coordinating not just on defense, but on economic policy, seeking to reduce dependency on the West African CFA franc and exploring alternatives that would give them greater monetary sovereignty. They are pushing for a confederated structure that could eventually evolve into a more formalized union. If successful, this would represent the most significant challenge to French influence in West Africa since decolonization. It would also create a precedent for other countries in the region, particularly those frustrated with existing security arrangements and economic dependencies. Western governments are watching this closely because the stakes extend beyond the Sahel. If the Alliance of Sahel States succeeds in stabilizing its territories, securing its borders, and building a viable alternative to Western-led security frameworks, it could inspire similar movements in other parts of Francophone Africa. Countries like Chad, Gabon, and even Senegal, where French military bases still operate, could begin questioning the necessity of those arrangements. The entire architecture of post-colonial influence in Africa, built on military partnerships, currency controls, and political dependencies, could start to fracture. That is what makes this moment so consequential. It is not just about one purge in one country. It is about whether the old system can survive the new generation of African leaders who refuse to accept it. Traore's actions also raise difficult questions about governance and accountability. The military tribunals handling the cases against Damiba and the dismissed generals are not transparent. International observers have been denied access. The evidence of sabotage has not been made fully public. While Traore's government insists that due process is being followed, critics argue that the speed and scope of the purge suggest a consolidation of power rather than a genuine effort to root out corruption. This tension between national sovereignty and international norms is not unique to Burkina Faso, but it is playing out here with unusual intensity. The question is whether Traore can maintain legitimacy while operating outside the frameworks that Western governments recognize as legitimate. For France, the loss is strategic and symbolic. Strategically, it no longer has the ability to shape security policy in one of the Sahel's most important countries. Symbolically, it has been publicly rejected by a government that owes nothing to French support and sees no reason to seek French approval. The narrative that France is an indispensable partner in African security has been shattered, not by rhetoric, but by results. Burkina Faso's military is functioning more effectively without French oversight. Its government is more stable without French political interference. Its regional alliances are stronger without French mediation. These are not the outcomes Paris anticipated when it warned against expelling French forces, and they are not outcomes it can easily reverse. What happens next could redefine the region. If Burkina Faso continues to stabilize, if the Alliance of Sahel States deepens its cooperation, if the new military command structure proves capable of pushing back jihadist expansion, then the entire premise of Western intervention in the Sahel collapses. If, however, the purge leads to internal fractures, if the new officers prove unable to manage the insurgency, if the alliance fractures under pressure, then critics of Traoré's approach will claim vindication. The next 12 to 18 months will be decisive. But right now, in this moment, Traoré has changed the calculation. He has eliminated the internal networks that foreign powers relied on to maintain influence. He has restructured the military around officers who owe their positions to battlefield performance rather than foreign endorsement. He has aligned Burkina Faso with a regional bloc that shares his vision of sovereignty and rejects Western oversight. And he has done all of this while the governments that once shaped events in the Sahel watch from the outside, issuing statements that carry less weight with each passing day. The purge of Burkina Faso's army was not just a domestic power struggle. It was a declaration that the rules have changed, that the old levers of influence no longer work, and that a new generation of African leadership is willing to risk isolation, sanctions, and condemnation to chart its own course. Whether that course leads to stability or further chaos remains uncertain, but the willingness to take that risk and the capacity to survive the immediate backlash has already shifted the balance of power in one of the world's most volatile regions. France's alarm is not about what has happened. It is about what comes next and the growing realization that it may no longer have the ability to shape that outcome.